Hello, and thanks for stopping by. The 1960s were a fascinating time for London. The decade certainly had its dark side. The city was still heavily scarred by World War II damage, the Kray twins were on the prowl, and many families, as demonstrated in Ken Loach's devastating film Cathy Come Home, were living in dire circumstances. But there was a lot to be optimistic about too, with music, film and fashion all bursting into psychedelic colour. Not forgetting also, of course, that England won the World Cup at Wembley in 1966. In the spring of 1966, this exciting atmosphere led the American magazine Time to dub London the Swinging City, and out of the capital's countless streets, there was one place in particular that came to embody that spirit. Carnaby Street, a relatively short road tucked between Regent Street and the western edge of Soho. In this video, we will of course be looking at Carnaby Street in its 1960s heyday. Although with a history dating back a good few centuries, there's a lot more to its story than a single decade, including tales of plague, murder, and even a tornado. Yes, you heard that right. So, let's begin now then by heading way back to where it all started. In centuries past, the land upon which Carnaby Street now lies was comprised of two fields, which happened to be the property of Eton College. In 1531 though, this real estate was handed over to Henry VIII, a king you couldn't really say no to, could you? And he promptly turned the patch into his own personal hunting ground. In the late 16th century, the lease on this land was acquired by Thomas Pulteney, after who Great Pulteney Street, close to Carnaby Street, is named. And during this era, the area came to be known as 6 Acre Close, which, in line with its rural name, even had a windmill. Something to think about next time you're battling shoppers on Regent Street. During the Great Plague of 1665 to 1666, a fellow named William Craven founded the Earl Craven's Pest House charity, and built a so-called pest house, or to put it more politely, a lazaretto, a place of quarantine, approximately where Marshall Street and Dufour's Place now lie. Designated for the reception of poor and miserable objects, the purpose of the pest house was to offer some comfort to those suffering from the horrific disease, although of course most of those afflicted with it perished. As such, an old plague burial pit lurks somewhere beneath Dufour's Place and Poland Street, and for a time this area was known as Pest Fields, with many believing the land to be cursed with disease. Lord Macaulay perhaps best summed it up some years later when he wrote, "Near where now stands Golden Square was a field not to be passed without a shudder by any Londoner of that age. There, as in a place far from the haunts of man, had been dug a pit, into which the dead carts had nightly shot corpses by scores." It was in the 1670s and 80s that the district we now know as Soho began to take shape. This was thanks, in part, to the Great Fire of London. In the wake of that devastating blaze, those who could afford to gravitated west, where large grand family homes were established, along with the streets and squares to accommodate them. One such mansion was Karnaby House. That's Carnaby spelt with a K, which was built in 1683 by a bricklayer named Richard Tyler. His name is recalled in a rather grubby alley called Tyler's Court, which stretches between Wardour Street and Berwick Street. Whoever the Carnabys were though, is a piece of information that's now long lost. Carnaby with a K is indeed a surname though. It's of Anglo-Saxon origin and roughly translates as Ken Settlement, and there's a small village called Carnaby in the East Riding of Yorkshire, close to Bridlington. But whether or not there's a connection with any of these aspects, I guess we'll never know for sure. Carnaby Street itself, named of course after Karnaby House, which came to stand on its eastern side, was laid out 2 years later, and in some early references, the street's name is spelt with a K. In those early days, a good many Huguenot families, who'd fled persecution in France, sought refuge on Carnaby Street, Indeed, one rate book dating from the late 17th century describes one house here as being, quote, filled with French Protestants. A market known as, no prizes for guessing, Carnaby Market, also sprang up here, and apparently it was notable for an abattoir which employed female butchers. It's been suggested by the author Peter Ackroyd that this inspired the poet and artist William Blake, who was born very close to Carnaby Street on the corner of Broadwick Street and Marshall Street, to create this gruesome illustration of three women disemboweling a man, which appeared in his epic early 19th century work, Jerusalem. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, it would appear that Carnaby Street was a rather rough and ready place. In 1737, for example, it was reported that a couple, a Mr. and Mrs. Mudd of Carnaby Street, had an argument, which led Mrs. Mudd to snatch a knife from her side and stab her husband through the back, upon which he dropped down dead. More bizarrely, in 1759, it was stated that, quote, a young man, in the shameful disguise of a conjurer, with a large wig, a hat of an extraordinary size, and an old nightgown on, was committed by John Fielding, who was the famous blind magistrate, to Tothill Fields Prison Bridewell, being charged with having used subtle craft to deceive and impose on His Majesty's subjects. The young man in question resided at a pub on Carnaby Street called the Golden Head, and he'd been charging unsuspecting dupes 1 shilling a go to tell their fortune, which in every single case never came true. Who'd have thought it, eh? But con man aside, it sounds like, with his outlandish disguise, he certainly made one of Carnaby Street's earliest fashion statements. Speaking of pubs, this is the Shakespeare's Head, which is very old indeed. There's been a tavern at this site, at the very top of Carnaby Street, since 1753. This current incarnation dates from 1928, and its original owners, John and Thomas Shakespeare, claimed they were distant relations of William Shakespeare. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's certainly a good example of an early cash-in. If you look up at the pub, you'll see a bust of the bard peering down. Notice how he has a hand missing? That's a war wound. It was blasted off when a bomb exploded close to here during the Blitz. Another pub close to here is the John Snow on Broadwick Street, outside of which you'll find this replica of a 19th century water pump. In 1854, this area was struck by an outbreak of cholera, with residents living on and around Carnaby Street hit particularly hard. In all, over 600 people in Soho died of the disease within the space of just a few months. In response to this, the physician, John Snow, hypothesised that contaminated water was the cause, as opposed to the foul-smelling air, or miasma, as the Victorians believed it to be at the time. As such, and having found that nearly all of the deaths had taken place within a short distance of this pump, Snow had its handle removed, thus cutting off a source of heavily polluted water, an action which swiftly reduced the mortality rate. Sadly, John Snow died a few years later, aged just 45, so I think it's only fitting that he gets to have a pub named in his honour. In 1819, the Grand Thoroughfare, Regent Street, began to take shape on the western fringe of Carnaby Street. The architect who masterminded it, John Nash, had originally wanted the Grand Boulevard to incorporate Golden Square in order to make the path straighter, which would have required the demolition of Carnaby Street, although thankfully of course this didn't happen. Once Regent Street was up and running, its influence began to spread across two Carnaby Streets, leading to numerous shops and businesses being established, some of which were restaurants, geared towards serving the numerous international communities who lived in Soho at the time. This, for example, is J. Stegmeyer's, a Hungarian restaurant which was located at numbers 53 to 54, and at the start of the 20th century there was a Japanese restaurant here too, which received rave reviews. Despite this encroaching glitz, Carnaby Street in the mid-19th to early 20th century was also known for its many sweatshops. These mainly employed women who worked exceedingly long hours, mostly churning out garments for the gentlemen's outfitters on nearby Savile Row. So bad were the conditions that, in May 1909, an estimated 700 women came out on strike on Carnaby Street, and a few violent scuffles ensued. Then, a few decades later in World War II, officers from the Flying Squad uncovered a huge black market operation hidden away on Carnaby Street. This outfit was essentially a large depot where stolen goods were processed, and the spiv behind it, Louis Danvers, had registered the building as IMPS Limited. Imps, get it? For this, Louis and 3 of his mates were flung in prison. Another building of interest on Carnaby Street was a small power station, opened in 1899 by the St James's and Pall Mall Electric Lighting Company, which in 1932 would go on to provide the first electrical power for illuminating the famous lights at Piccadilly Circus. Prior to that, the display had been gaslit. That old power station has long since been demolished, although this art installation, a giant electric plug on Ganton Street, which was unveiled in 2005, is no doubt a nod to it. Whilst we're on the subject of electricity, it's worth noting that when Battersea Power Station was up and running, the controllers there used Carnaby Street as a code term for 2 very important switches. Carnaby Street 1 referred to the Houses of Parliament, whilst Carnaby Street 2 was code for Buckingham Palace. If you'd like to learn more about Battersea Power Station, I've devoted an entire video to it, which I'll link below. Arguably, the most shocking incident to occur on Carnaby Street in the early 20th century took place on the evening of the 23rd of October 1928, when a small tornado tore through the area. This occurred at the height of a fierce storm, and the tornado in question appears to have formed on Piccadilly. It then roared across Carnaby Street before fizzling out on Great Marlborough Street. One resident living on Carnaby Street, Mrs. Ashlaws, recalled that the house was rocking terribly. It was just as though I was being rocked in a cradle. A bicycle was held some 100 yards through the air along Carnaby Street, and an elderly gentleman named Mr. McClendon was seriously injured when the wind swept him off his feet and smashed him back to earth, leading to a fractured skull. Elsewhere, another man claimed he had to grip a set of railings for dear life, chimneys came crashing down, and in Carnaby Street and Great Marlborough Street alone, 140 shop signs were destroyed and many windows were smashed. It was also in the early 20th century that a number of fashionable nightclubs began to establish themselves on Carnaby Street. The first of these, located at number 50, was the Florence Mills Social Parlour, which was named in honour of Florence Mills, a famous Harlem jazz performer who died in 1927, aged just 31. This pioneering night spot was opened in the early 1930s by Amy Ashwood Garvey, in conjunction with the Trinidadian calypso singer Sam Manning, and it quickly became the go-to venue for those interested in Pan-African politics. The Florence Mills Social Parlour was sold in 1938, after which it became known as the Blue Lagoon. It was here, shortly after the war, that a notorious murder occurred, for it was outside the Blue Lagoon on the evening of the 9th of November 1946 that a 25-year-old woman named Margaret Cook was shot dead. A patrolling bobby heard the gunshot, which had struck Margaret through the heart, and he saw a man wearing a Burberry coat and pork pie hat fleeing the scene, prompting a constable to give chase, although he lost the suspect amongst crowds close to Oxford Circus tube station. The case went cold until 2015, when a 91-year-old unnamed man in Ontario confessed to the murder, his reason being that he'd been diagnosed with cancer and wished to clear his conscience. This mystery man, who was originally a British citizen, he'd been living in Canada since 1951, claimed he'd shot Margaret after she cheated him out of money, and when police showed him a collection of photographs, he was able to correctly identify her. There were reports that British authorities wished to extradite him, but with no evidence, this attempt floundered. If this mysterious man was indeed guilty of killing Margaret Cook, then it's believed the Blue Lagoon case represents the longest period between a crime and a confession to occur in British legal history. In 1950, the Blue Lagoon became Club 11, a jazz cooperative which boasted Ronnie Scott amongst its ranks, although this closed after just 6 months, following a drugs raid which resulted in considerable scandal. By the 1960s, the club at number 50 was known as the Roaring Twenties, a popular hangout for the likes of the Beatles, Georgie Fame, and the Rolling Stones. In 1966, the Time magazine piece mentioned at the start of this video had the following words to say about Carnaby Street. Perhaps nothing illustrates the new shining London better than narrow 3-block Carnaby Street, which is crammed with a cluster of the gear boutiques, where the girls and boys buy each other clothing. 9 of the shops for boys on Carnaby Street are owned by designer John Stephen. John Stephen is indeed a very important figure when it comes to the history of Carnaby Street, for he was the main driving force behind the area's transformation into a fashion hotspot, an achievement that earned him the nickname the King of Carnaby Street. One of 9 children, John was born in Glasgow in 1934 and was initially apprenticed as a welder before moving down to London in 1952. After a spell working at Moss Brothers in Covent Garden, John's good looks helped him land a role as a sales assistant at a pioneering fashion boutique called Vince, which was located on Newburgh Street. Catering largely for the gay community, at a time when homosexuality was still illegal, Vince had been established by the photographer Bill Green, who specialised in portraits of bodybuilders and male models, one of his muses including a then unknown Sean Connery, who'd pose at the nearby Marshall Street Barbs, now the Marshall Street Leisure Centre. Once he'd gained some experience in the industry, John Stevens, along with his partner Bill Franks, opened his first shop at 19 Beak Street in 1957, which they called his Clothes. To attract business, John and Bill painted the walls yellow and piped through the latest records. They also displayed the clothes, which they designed and created themselves, on racks which were free to browse, as opposed to the more traditional method of keeping the merchandise secured in cabinets. This all sounds run-of-the-mill, but for the 1950s, such innovations were revolutionary and would pave the way for the trendy clothes shops we know today. His Clothes rapidly became very popular, with Cliff Richard and Frankie Vaughan being amongst John's earliest customers. Sadly, the Beak Street shop was destroyed by fire, but John didn't hang around, and in 1959 he moved the business just around the corner to number 5 Carnaby Street. By the late 1950s, this of course being in the wake of the Second World War, Carnaby Street had become something of a grey backwater, known for its desolate warehouses. But John's shop brought an immediate surge of life and colour, and within just 5 years, his 9 shops mentioned in the Time article had all been established and were doing a roaring trade.
Take a beat from the street.
Once John Stevens had set up shop on Carnaby Street, many more boutiques followed, bearing names such as Dandy Fashions, The Button Queen, Lady Jane, Mates, Kleptomania, Granny Takes a Trip, Gear, and I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet. One shop that was particularly notable was Lord John, which was opened by 3 brothers, David, Harold and Warren Gold, on the corner of Ganton Street in 1963, and it came to boast a larger psychedelic mural. The establishment of all of these shops also of course coincided with an exciting wave of music created by legendary acts such as the Beatles, The Who, the Rolling Stones, Dusty Springfield, Jimi Hendrix, and many, many more. Most of who, along with their fans, flocked to Carnaby Street to indulge in the latest fashions and ensure they looked the part. The London-formed group, the Small Faces, based themselves on Carnaby Street, as commemorated by this plaque. And in their 1966 song, dedicated follower of fashion, the Kinks sang about the Carnabetian army marching on. That same year, Tom Jones and the actress Christine Spooner took a stroll along Carnaby Street with a cheetah in order to promote a new shop called Tomcat, whilst this footage shows Barry Gibb from the Bee Gees being mobbed there in 1969. Also present, up on the balcony, were the Equals, Millie Small and Status Quo. Plenty of American stars made sure they were seen on Carnaby Street too, everyone from Sonny and Cher to Bob Dylan, Faye Dunaway, Sammy Davis Jr. and Liberace, and naturally, many visual artists hung out on Carnaby Street as well. one regular visitor being the pop artist Peter Blake. Indeed, it's believed Blake's most famous work, the cover of the Beatles' 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, may well have been inspired by the I Was Lord Kitchener's valet shop, which specialised in vintage military clothes. When Christmas came around, even the festive lights adorning Carnaby Street were suitably groovy too. Not everyone was impressed with Carnaby Street's way out fashions though. In January 1967, former Ready Steady Go presenter Patrick Kerr was arrested in Madrid, the reason being that the Spanish authorities considered his Carnaby bought togs, which included a striped Regency jacket, purple satin shirt, and blue bell-bottoms trousers, to be, quote, obscene. Carnaby Street's flame burned bright in the 1960s, but the incredible momentum would soon prove too much to sustain. Cottoning on to just how stylish clothes could be for a mass market, shops selling Carnaby-style threads began popping up on high streets everywhere, particularly along Oxford Street, and eventually John Stevens turned his attentions to establishing new boutiques abroad. John closed his last shop therefore on Carnaby Street in 1975, and he passed away in 2004. Today he's marked by this plaque at number 1. Many believe Carnaby Street's real decline commenced in 1973 when the road was closed to traffic, thus making it one of London's first fully pedestrianised streets. Although pedestrianisation is par for the course nowadays, it puts many celebrities and wealthy shoppers off coming to Carnaby Street, as it's meant they could no longer be taken straight to the door of their favourite boutiques. And John Stevens was particularly unhappy, as it meant he couldn't park his signature Rolls-Royce outside. Furthermore, the authorities decided to tile Carnaby Street in a rather garish design. The tiles, which bore geometric shapes in orange, black and white, were made of nylon, and when first unveiled, the Times described this unorthodox paving as feeling slightly elastic, so pedestrians feel like pawns on a vast spongy chessboard. This scheme, which remained in place until the mid-1980s, wasn't popular with the good many residents. The owner of Indowix, for example, then England's oldest pipe maker, told reporters he thought the design was hideous, whilst a nearby office worker said it made the street stick out like a sore thumb. Alongside the rubbery tiles, souvenir shops began to muscle in too, peddling postcards and empty cans claiming to contain London fog, all of which lent the once chic destination a somewhat tackier vibe, a mood which lasted well into the 1990s. Nevertheless, Carnaby Street still maintained a presence in pop music. This famous photo of the Sex Pistols, no doubt intended to be ironic, was taken there in 1976, and the following year, the B-side to the Jam's All Around the World was entitled Carnaby Street and sang about the famous road, albeit from a rather pessimistic point of view. The music magazines, Smash Hits and The NME, also had their offices pretty much opposite each other here in the 1970s and 80s. Thankfully, Carnaby Street has since spruced itself up, and looks far smarter nowadays. The clothes shops are back, although they're now mainly chain stores, which, it goes without saying, hold nothing of the excitement which the boutiques of the 1960s would have offered, but it's still worth a visit considering how much history lies behind the place, and the little streets surrounding it, such as Newburgh Street and Kingly Court, are full of character, and have come together to form their own distinct quarter. One particular hidden gem you'll find here, and one which a lot of shoppers seem to miss, can be seen on the corner of Carnaby Street and Broadwick Street. It's this large mural, entitled Spirit of Soho, which was unveiled by the musician George Melly in 1990. I have a feeling we'll be seeing some of these faces in future videos. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at Carnaby Street, and would love to hear your own thoughts and memories related to this famous destination. Have you ever purchased clothes here? What songs can you think of which mention the street? And do you remember the strange, rubbery black and orange tiles? If so, please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so. as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.